is Debbie from Lime Doodle Design, and I'm delighted to be guesting for W+9 today. I've got some of the products from the recent April release. I love the brush font in the Biggest Fan set, and it's got some cracking sentiments to go along with that big love you. And then the gorgeous rose background die, and then also some cute pandas from the Friends for All Season spring set. I wanted to use some of these supplies to create two cards with a totally different feel. Firstly, I wanted to watercolour a background for the rose background die in some hot sunset colours, and then switch those colours out for a softly blended pastel background and adding in a cute panda from the Friends for All Season spring set. I'm starting off by die cutting the rose background die from some Nina Solar White in the 80-pound weight. I've added in a metal shim into the sandwich to make sure that this detailed die cuts nicely through the cardstock. It's then just a case of removing the negative portions and you're left with a beautiful die cut background. I'm going to be placing this die over a watercolour piece, and for that I'm going to be using some Archer's cold press watercolour card which I've taped down to a board to help prevent it warping. The colours I'm mainly going to be using are Quinacridone Coral by Daniel Smith, and then Lemon Yellow and Indian Yellow by Schminker. And I'm preparing some puddles of those colours in preparation for bringing them onto the watercolour card. I'm going to start with the wet on wet technique, and so I'm laying down a wash of water before bringing in the paints, and that layer of water will enable the paints to blend beautifully together. I'm starting at the top of the panel with the Quinacridone Coral and then coming down through the Indian Yellow to the Lemon Yellow to get that gradation of colour. Now that I've got the base layer down, I'm starting to bring in some deeper colour to give variation. At this point the panel is still wet, so those colours spread out. However, I'm going to hit it with a heat tool and then I can start adding more layers on top. I want to get some of the real heat of the colour where the centres of the flowers are, so I'm using the die cut as a guide to where to add more colour to the panel. I often think that watercolouring can look a bit of a hot mess until the point that it doesn't, which probably isn't very helpful, but I will say that no matter what, when you're adding a die as beautiful as the rose background die over the top, you could probably put that die over a toddler's artwork and it would still look gorgeous. So once I'd finally finished fiddling around and adding hot spots of colour, I'm then going to give it one final hit with heat tool, and then I'm going to add some splatters. I'm using some of the colours that I used previously, and I'm also adding in the Schminker silver paint to give some variation in colour, to give some highlights. You could use a white paint or even some Perfect Pearls mixed up into a solution of water and splattered over, anything to give a bit of variation to the background. Once the piece is fully dry, you can then carefully peel back the painter's tape, and the panel is ready to have the rose background die placed on top. And for that I'm going to be using some foam tape. I've cut thin strips of foam tape and added those to the edges of the die and also to the flower centres, and then place that over the watercoloured piece. For the sentiment I wanted to use that Love You from the Biggest Fan set. I think that brush font is gorgeous, and I found that it would fit nicely into a stitch circle die. I'm going to heat emboss the sentiment on vellum, and so I've placed a piece of Basil 40 pounds vellum in the Mini Misty, and then I'm going to treat that with the EK Success powder tool, which will stop any embossing powder sticking where you don't want it to. I'm using Simon Stamp clear embossing and watermark ink, and making sure to give that a good press down to get the best impression. I keep my embossing powders in spice shakers, and I've picked out the antique gold embossing powder and sprinkled that on top of the sentiment, giving it a good tap to get rid of any excess. And then I've made sure my heat tool is good and hot before bringing it to the sentiment to melt the embossing powder. I can then line up the stitch circle die, run that through the die cutting machine, and then I'm going to foam mount that over the rose background panel. I'm using my grid mat to help me get it centred, and then I'm placing it just slightly above the midway line. The final touch is to add some toning sequins, and I'm keeping those in place with some Ranger Multi-Medium in matte. And then the finished panel is ready to be mounted onto a card base. I think the rose background die is gorgeous, and it really pops off those hot sunset colours of the watercoloured background. And now I'm going to switch things up by using the same supplies to create this cute card with a softly ink blended background. I've already die cut the rose background from Nina Solar White card, and I'm using another panel of Nina Solar White to blend in some dye inks. I'm using Sam Says Stamp, Cotton Candy, Melon and Sea Glass dye inks. I'm starting with Cotton Candy in the bottom right corner, and then I'm going to blend that out into Melon and then finally into Sea Glass. Because we're going to be placing the rose background die over the top of this, the ink blending doesn't have to be perfect, and I'm also going to add some splatters a bit later, so again, you don't have to have perfectly ink blended backgrounds when you're actually placing so many other things on top. I've gone back to my paint palette to add the splatters. I'm using Daler Brown Othello Turquoise, Daniel Smith Quinacridone Coral, Schminker Silver, and then some more of the Schminker Indian Yellow. I've added thin strips of foam adhesive to the back of the rose background die, and then I'm going to place that on top of the ink blended panel. This time for the sentiment, I'm stamping the Love You from the Biggest Fan set in VersaFine Honest black ink onto Nina's Solar white, and then again I'm going to cut that out with the same stitch circle that I used for the other card. I'm also going to stamp one of the cute pandas from the Friends for All Seasons spring set, and I'm going to stamp that in Sam Says Stamp Intense black ink. This is a Copic friendly ink, and I'm going to add some rosy cheeks later on, so I wanted to make sure that I used a Copic friendly ink. I'm double stamping it using the Misty stamping tool to make sure that I get a really good black outline on the panda, and then adding in the Missing You sentiment. I ended up stamping the panda again because I wasn't quite happy with how I'd lined up the Missing You sentiment. These are the matching dies to the Friends for All Seasons stamp set, and I'm trimming out the relevant panda die with a set of tin snips, and then I'm going to run that through the die cutting machine. Having worked out where I wanted to place the sentiment and the panda, I'm again using the grid mat to help me place the sentiment so that it is centred but slightly just below the midway line this time, and then adding the cute panda to the side. Once again I'm adding a few turning sequins with range multimedia and matte, and then I'm adding the finished panel to a card base. With both cards complete, you can see that the rose background die looks stunning placed on any background. Today we've used watercolours and a softly ink blended background, but it would look equally stunning on top of pattern paper. The gorgeous brush font of the Biggest Fan set can also adapt to different styles, complementing the gold embossing on vellum of the hot watercoloured sunset card, and equally the soft pastel background of the cute panda card. I want to thank you for joining me today, and Dawn and W+9 for having me as their guest. If you'd like to see more from me, then you can find me blogging at limedoodledesign.com, where you'll also find links to my social media and YouTube channel. I'll say bye for now, and I hope you have a great day.